Yesterday in my program, at the very end, I made a rather cynical, or if you prefer, sardonic comment in which I suggested that given that the Russians clearly do not want to get it drawn into negotiations with Ukraine at this particular point in time, and given that various Russian officials, including Lavrov, Putin, and most recently Shoigu, have said that negotiations with the Ukraine are totally ruled out so long as the Ukrainians remain in Kursk region, well, I suggested that given the fact that the Russians are under some pressure now to engage the Ukrainians in negotiations from their Brazilian and Indian friends, that it might actually work to Russia's advantage to slow walk the expulsion of the Ukrainians from Kursk region and to allow the Ukrainians to retain some kind of foothold in Kursk region, at least for a while, given the heavy Ukrainian losses that the Ukrainians are experiencing in Kursk, and the fact that the Russians have said and have apparently got their friends in India and Brazil to accept that negotiations are totally ruled out whilst the Ukrainians are present in Kursk. Well, that was yesterday, and it just took a few hours for the Russians to take actions which strongly suggest that they have no intention of acting on the cynical principles that I floated yesterday. Because this morning and last night, we were starting to get lots of reports about a major Russian counterattack in Kursk region, a counterattack that has apparently resulted in the rapid recapture by the Russians of 10 villages in the western section of the enclave that the Ukrainians have carved out in Kursk region. The Russians have now recaptured the important village of Snagist. Now, I have to say, Snagist is an intriguing place in terms of this war because it was generally acknowledged that the Ukrainians successfully captured Snagist in the early days of their offensive in Kursk. Then I remember that some weeks ago, in connection with the battles that were taking place for the nearby village or small town of Korenovo, firmly under Russian control, and which the Ukrainians have never succeeded in capturing. Anyway, I recall that Radovka reported Snagist as having been recaptured by the Russians in connection with those battles. Then Group of Forces North and the Russian Defense Ministry started to publish various reports that implied that Snagist was firmly under Russian control. Then, about 3 weeks ago, I noticed that they'd stopped doing that. They weren't talking about Snagist very much anymore. And it's clear that at some point the Ukrainians either recaptured Snagist from the Russians, or perhaps the earlier report from Radovka was wrong, and the reports that Group of Forces North and the Russian Defense Ministry had published, which seemed to imply that Snagist was under Russian control, they were intentionally misleading. Now, of course, I don't know which of these is true. I'm going to guess that the Russians did, for a time, perhaps rather briefly, re-enter and perhaps regain control of Snagist, but more likely than not, in connection with the very intense battles that were taking place for Korenovo and the general shortage of Russian troops in the Kursk region, the Russians perhaps decided to pull back. Anyway, there doesn't seem to be any doubt that they have now recaptured Snagist. And they've recaptured a whole string of other villages in the area of Snagist, around 10 in total, none of which, I'm going to say straightforwardly, I remember from any previous discussion of the offensive in Kursk. Maybe I've spoken about them some places, but I suspect that none of them are big or important places. But for what it's worth, the Russians appear to have regained all 10 of them. So there we are. Now, Group of Forces North, in their update this morning, say that the Russian advance in the Kursk area over the last 24 hours has been 3 kilometers. There are some claims that, in fact, this offensive, this lightning attack, which captured all these places, didn't actually happen over the last 24 hours, but took place 3 days ago. Again, I have no way of knowing one way or the other. Group of Forces North sort of suggests that it took place over the last 24 hours. But then, of course, it may be that this was another one of those operations that the Russian military conducted, that they didn't want to tell us anything about, that they imposed a news blockade about it. And now that it has succeeded, or partially succeeded, or at least succeeded in its immediate objectives with the capture of Snagist, they're able to report it. And that's why Group of Forces North is reporting it now. And it may also explain why, in order to explain the presence of the Russians on this territory, and rather than acknowledge that this was an operation conducted in secret 3 days ago, Group of Forces North are giving the impression that it happened over the last 24 hours. There might be some strength to the idea that the operation did take place several days ago and that the Russians are only reporting it now, from something else that Group of Forces North has said, which is that in their latest comment, they've pointedly published a section in their report in which they ask Russian bloggers and Telegram channels to remember that it is sometimes necessary not to talk about ongoing military operations, that the Ukrainians weren't doing that at the start of the Kursk offensive, and that it's better not to discuss military operations sometimes when they're underway, because that can, in fact, interfere with the development of those operations by alerting the Ukrainians to what is going on. So, that might imply that, in fact, this operation did indeed take place several days ago. But let me stress again, I don't know. Anything that I say on this is just guess, and I don't really think anyway that it matters. Suffice to say that the Russians have apparently recaptured 10 villages in the western section of Ukraine's Kursk enclave, and have recaptured the important village, or relatively important village, or important village relative to the events of this theatre of Snagist. And the other thing that we are hearing is that various Ukrainian troops who are located to the west of Snagist, to the west of this area where the Russians advanced, and the main advance seems to have taken place from the southward, from the town of Korenovo in the north. There are reports that significant numbers of Ukrainian troops have been cut off and isolated by this attack, which has enabled the Russians to cut the main roads. And this has left these Ukrainian troops exposed to the operations that the Russians now conduct fairly regularly in Kursk region, whereby they hunt down and track and eventually capture or kill these Ukrainian soldiers who are left behind in this kind of way. This has happened several times over the Battle of Kursk. More often it's been the case of the Ukrainians sending their sabotage and reconnaissance groups along the country roads behind Russian lines, finding that they're then cut off and can't return, trying to hide in the forests, only eventually to be hunted down and killed or captured by the Russians. Now, I don't know how many Ukrainian troops have been captured or trapped or cut off in this area, in the western part of Ukraine's Kursk enclave. I doubt it is more than a couple of hundred. The forces that each side deploys on this battle, in this battle that's ongoing in the Kursk area, on the front lines, are actually relatively small. Now, there have been, by the way, pictures. The Russians have published pictures of Ukrainian prisoners. And, well, it looks in the pictures that we're talking about perhaps a dozen or so people. But, of course, that's only one picture. It may be that there are lots of others. And I'm not, again, going to try and guess exactly what is going on. The most interesting thing about this attack, well, at least for me, one of the most interesting things about this particular attack is that for the first time, we learn of a Russian military unit that has participated in it that was involved in fighting in Donbas. And this is the 106th Airborne Guards Division of the Russian Airborne Forces. Very, very much an elite division of the Russian army. I believe it numbers around 8,000 men, though that might be an overestimate. Anyway, it seems that a unit, maybe a battalion or a brigade of the 106th Airborne Guards Division spearheaded this attack on Snagist. And of course, this is a formidable force made up of paratroopers. And there's pictures of this armored convoy of these troops thundering down the country road towards Snagist. I noticed that there was absolutely no Ukrainian resistance. There was no Ukrainian FPV drones, no Ukrainian artillery, nothing. So the Russians were able to advance from Korenovo all the way to Snagist, as far as I can tell, unobstructed and unresisted. Anyway, I don't know how many of these troops, these tough paratroopers, the Russians have reassigned to the Kursk region. The 106th Airborne Guards Division, the area where it has been fighting, and in fact the place where it has been spearheading the Russian offensive in Donbas, has been the Seversk area. And the Russians have, as a matter of fact, made significant progress in the Seversk area over the last few weeks. It could be that because of this, and because of a general sense that the area around Seversk is now gradually falling under Russian control, and that the Russians have been able to isolate Seversk itself, or at least are coming close to doing so, that a decision was made that the 106th Airborne Guards Division could spare a battalion or two to send to Kursk region. Alternatively, it might be the case that the Russian General Staff assesses that Seversk, that the whole Seversk area, is of secondary importance, and that it should not be given, is not being given the kind of priority that Pokrovsk, Selidovo, Vuhledar, Toretsk, and Chasiv Yar are all being given. So it could be that that explains the reassignment of this force. But anyway, I'm not going to explore this in any detail. I mean, I don't know. The Russian General Staff, as I said, doesn't share its decisions or its reasons for its decisions with me. All I would say is that if you want evidence of a redeployment of Russian troops from the Donbas to Kursk, well, you finally have it. A battalion, at least one battalion of the 106th Airborne Guards Division, which was located previously around Siversk, has now been deployed in Kursk region and has carried out this attack. Now, what does this attack mean? Is this the start of a major Russian offensive in Kursk intended to roll the Ukrainians back and to push them across the border? Well, possibly. I would say that the major Ukrainian forces are not located in this area. They appear to be located or concentrated around the town of Sudzha in the south and along the border with Russia. The Ukrainian forces that have moved beyond this small area around Sudzha and have tried to capture various villages have never been very strong. They number usually around 20 to 100 men. 100 is a large force for a Ukrainian attack in the Kursk area, just saying. So it's further south along the border and around Sudzha itself that the main Ukrainian forces are based. And it is in that area, by the way, that the Russians are conducting their artillery and airstrikes and their missile strikes on these Ukrainian forces that are located in Kursk region. So this attack, this successful attack by the Russians, well, it's obviously more than a skirmish, but it may be more of tactical significance. It may be that it's intended to stabilize the positions around Korenovo and to prevent a Ukrainian advance westwards in the area where the Ukrainians some weeks ago now were destroying bridges across the Seine River. There's lots of speculation at that time that the Ukrainians were going to launch an advance into this territory south of the Seine River and try to occupy it. It never happened. And the Russians have now built lots of pontoon bridges in this area, apparently sorting out fully their logistics. So it looks as if this is never going to happen now. But anyway, it could be, it might be, that this is more a sort of tactical operation, as I said, intended to stabilize this area, which is important area. It was one of the positions, Korenovo in particular, one of the positions which the Ukrainians needed to capture in order to anchor their enclave and perhaps possibly one day advance to the Kursk nuclear power plant, which, as we will see, the Russians have again confirmed was the Ukrainians' original objective. But it could be, it might be, that this is the beginning of something bigger and that the Russians are indeed planning at some point over the next couple of days or weeks to conduct a broader offensive on the Ukrainian forces in Kursk region. Maybe that they do intend to push them beyond the border and to recapture Sudzha itself. Now, I would say that there is a lot of discussion about what the Ukrainians are going to do. I noticed that the Military Summary channel is talking again about the Ukrainians renewing their offensive in Kursk. Supposedly, if Tony Blinken does give the Ukrainians permission to use their long-range missiles to strike at Russian positions deep inside Russia, this will enable the Ukrainians to resume their offensive in Kursk. Supposedly, the Ukrainians stopped their offensive in Kursk because the Western powers didn't give them the permission to use the long-range missiles in that way. I think that there is no connection between the two. I think that the missiles, if they are used by the Ukrainians to conduct long-range missile strikes against Russia, will not make any difference whatsoever to the situation in Kursk region. I think the reason the Ukrainians ran out of steam in Kursk region is because the geography, the topography is impossible. We're talking about small villages, country roads, hills, streams, and forests. Very difficult territory to advance through. The Russians have brought significant forces to this area now. They've established very strong fortifications to the north, and the Ukrainians have suffered appalling losses in Kursk region under the weight of Russian artillery fire and bombs and all of the rest. And with difficult logistics and all of the rest, I think it is completely unsurprising and wholly predictable that the Ukrainian offensive in Kursk ran out of steam, as it obviously did within the first 10 days of its launch. Just saying. Anyway, that's my view. I would add, by the way, that in a few weeks' time, we're going to be in the season of the Rasputitsa. I suspect that in this northern area, the Rasputitsa is going to be less severe than it is in the south, in the Dnieper basin, but it is nonetheless going to happen in the marshy soil, heavy forest and all of that, with, by the way, the vegetation thinning, which will mean that the Russian Air Force, the drones, will be able to spot the Ukrainians more easily in the forests. They've been trying to use the forests, apparently, to conceal themselves from the Russians. But I think that the weather conditions are going to turn against the Ukrainians over the course of the next few weeks. And I suspect that before long, a further advance in this area by the Ukrainians is going to be all but impossible. It's going to be impossible because the Russians are too strong, because the ground will be too soft and boggy, and it's going to be impossible because the cover provided by the trees will thin as the autumn leaves fall. Just saying. Now, whenever this topic gets discussed, people come forward and say, well, you know, it's true, you can't move vehicles very easily across boggy ground, but people can walk across it. Sort of people who say this, in my experience, are not walkers. As I've said, I've done quite a lot of walking. In my time, I would say that trying to move infantry over any sort of distance in the mud is a fool's game. Perhaps it can be done. Perhaps very well-trained infantry can do it. I doubt very much that the Ukrainian forces, under the weight of the Russian artillery and the bombs and the missiles and the TOS-1 flamethrowers, that they'll be able to do anything of that sort at all. By contrast, because the Russians have air superiority in this area, complete air superiority, as we saw with this armoured column trundling down the road from Korenovo, unimpeded. Anyway, because the Russians have complete air superiority, they can use the roads, the metalled roads, and of course they still have many, many more armoured vehicles, and they can move their forces far more quickly than the Ukrainians can. So I think that over the next few weeks, the weather conditions will also shift in the Russians' favour, and I suspect that over the course of October and November, the Russians will certainly be on the offensive in Kursk region, and the Ukrainians' problems there will multiply. If the Ukrainians had any sense, if they were making logical, rational military decisions, they would be pulling their men out of Kursk. In fact, they should have pulled their men out of Kursk very early on in the battle, when it became clear that they would not be able to capture the Kursk nuclear power plant. Now, on that topic, I've been watching Simplicius the Thinker on his latest Substack blog has published an excerpt of the interview that Shoigu gave to Russian television, and I've been able to catch a glimpse of that interview. I have actually now heard Shoigu himself, and it's important to remember that Shoigu is not just the former Russian defense minister, but he's also the secretary of the Security Council. He is the man to whom the Russian intelligence agencies now report, and who prepares the information from the intelligence agencies and passes it on to Putin. And according to some sources that I've had, he is still the person who, on Putin's behalf, retains overall supervision of the conduct of the special military operation. Andrei Belousov, the new defense minister, who is of course a civilian, has a managerial and administrative, and if you like, technocratic role. But Shoigu continues to be the person who keeps track on behalf of Putin of what is going on the battlefronts, and acts as the major point person through whom the military and Putin communicate with each other. But anyway, Shoigu clearly says in this interview that the Ukrainian objective was the capture of the Kursk nuclear power plant. I've now heard him say it. There is absolutely no doubt about it. None at all. Now, again, many people recoil at this possibility. They seem to think that it's inconceivable that Ukraine can do this. I still see people say that there is no evidence that the Ukrainians planned to capture the Kursk nuclear power plant. We have evidence that the Ukrainians did plan to capture the Kursk nuclear power plant, because it is what the Russians say. The Russians have, as they claim, intelligence, and their intelligence, they say, tells them that the Ukrainian objective was the capture of the Kursk nuclear power plant. Now, of course, that is evidence. It is not proof. It doesn't mean that because the Russians say something, it must be so. But, as I've said many times in many programs, there is nothing else in this territory that the Ukrainians could have been aiming for other than the Kursk nuclear power plant, that it would have been made any sense to try to capture. Just saying, if the Ukrainians had succeeded in capturing the Kursk nuclear power plant, that would have, of course, changed the whole situation. We would be looking at a completely different situation now from the one that we are looking at today. But they failed. I am sure that that was the Ukrainian objective. On this, I am sure that the Russians are right. There is no other sensible explanation or rational or even semi-rational explanation for what the Ukrainians were trying to do. The fact that they've given inconsistent and multiple explanations or rationalizations for the Kursk offensive ever since shows that for various reasons they don't want to admit to the actual objective, one of the reasons being, of course, that they failed to achieve it. So, for all of these reasons, I have no doubt that the Kursk nuclear power plant was the original Ukrainian objective. The point is that they could only have captured it in the first couple of days of the offensive in Kursk. Abtialodinov, the Chechen Special Forces commander, says that the intention was that they would have secured control of the nuclear power plant by the 11th of August. The operation, of course, was launched on the 6th of August. My own view is that for the Ukrainians to have any real prospect of seizing the power plant, they needed to reach it. Their forward commandos needed to reach it within the first 24 hours. That meant that they needed to capture Sudzha very, very quickly. On the first day, they encountered far more resistance in Sudzha than they expected. That set back their timetable. By the time they'd captured Sudzha, it was too late. The Russians had secured the nuclear power plant and the nearby town of Kurchatov, and from that moment onwards, the entire Ukrainian offensive lost its point. Anyway, that is my view. I think that that was the point when logically the Ukrainians should have withdrawn. They could have at that point said that they'd thrown the Russians off balance, that they'd humiliated Putin. There's always this desire in Ukraine and in the West to humiliate and embarrass Putin. Anyway, they could have claimed all of that, and they could have withdrawn their forces and conserved and preserved their forces, but they didn't do it. They chose instead to cling on, and now we see what is starting to happen. Anyway, that's enough about the situation in Kursk. Let's now turn to what is going on elsewhere on the battlefronts, because of course things are taking ever more serious and, from the Ukrainian point of view, disastrous turns. And here I'm going to mention first the Ukrainian MP, member of the Rada, Mariana Bezuglaya. There's lots of people who speculate about her purpose, her intentions. At one point, she was assumed to be a catspaw for Zelensky, undermining Zaluzhny, who was at that point Zelensky's political rival. I think most people have now stopped believing that that is the case. The latest theory that I've seen being spread is that Bezuglaya is actually a catspaw for Kirill Budanov, the intelligence chief. According to this theory, Budanov is still angry that he was passed over for the post of supreme Ukrainian military chief when Zaluzhny fell, that the job was given to Syrsky instead, and that Budanov, having used Bezuglaya to undermine Zaluzhny, is now using Bezuglaya to undermine Syrsky. Well, I can't, of course, disprove that. I am going to express my own view. I think that Bezuglaya is acting on her own. I think she's one of the most unusual people in Ukraine, in the sense that she appears to have some sort of genuine concern about what is going on the battlefronts. She makes some of the most cogent and intelligent criticism of the entire way in which the war is conducted. And I think it is most unlikely that she's acting on anybody's behalf. And I would say this, I think what she's doing is potentially putting her, it means putting herself at very considerable risk. Anyway, put all that aside, I'm not here to discuss Bezaglayev's motives, only what she's actually saying. And she's now discussing the entire situation in the Pokrovsk, Kurakhovo, Selidovo, Krasnogorovka area. And she has grasped a point which I have been making in multiple programs recently, that this is all now one giant battlefield, that all of these fights, all these battles, individual battles for Grodivka, and for Novogrodivka, for Selidovo, for Ukrainsk, for Girnik, for Vuhledar, for Krasnogorovka, which is now ended. All of these various battles, individual battles, are best understood as part of one big single battle being fought out over the vast expanse of the Ukrainian steppe, or at least the Donbas steppe. The Russians would not be pleased at my reference to this area as the Ukrainian steppe. Anyway, the steppe land. And it's best to think of these towns as individual fortified points, as this very dynamic and fluid battle plays out. The central objective being, of course, ultimately the town of Pokrovsk. So what happens in Vuhledar and Krasnogorovka and Ukrainsk affects the course of this entire battle, and it ultimately affects what happens in Pokrovsk itself. Now, this has been clear to me for about a week, and very interestingly, I see that Bezuglaya has come to exactly the same conclusion, and she is now criticizing Syrskyi for pretending that the situation is otherwise. She's made the following points. In the report of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Syrskyi has given an order to divide the Pokrovsk direction into two, Pokrovsk and the new Kurakhovsky direction to the south, so that Russian breakthroughs could continue in the Kurakhov area, and the isolated and narrow Pokrovsk area would seem to be more stable. And she puts the word stable in quotation marks. After all, the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces will not then have to say nonsense. I congratulate Alexander Syrskyi on his new discovery of this new direction. And she then makes the point that over the course of the 6 months that he's been in charge, we've now had a whole series of new directions opening up. Whenever there is a problem in one, he simply goes ahead and creates another in order to minimize the fact that problems are arising in the earlier one. Anyway, put aside these waspish comments about Syrskyi. The overall analysis is obviously right. She understands something which, as I said, most commentators don't seem to do. That, as I said, this is all one battle playing out over the entire southern Donbas, over the steppe land, the open country, very different, as I said, from the northern areas with their forests and swamps and the rivers and all of the rest. This is flat, open country, very well adapted to fluid, rapid movement, and that is indeed what we're seeing. Anyway, let me move on from Bezyglaya and let's discuss what's actually happening. Now, there's been more news from the Vuhledar area, and in summary, there seems to be a general growing consensus that the Russians have indeed succeeded in capturing the two coal mines, the one northeast of Vuhledar, the other some way to the west in the area of the village of Bogoyavlenka, northwest of Odyane. Again, some will say that we've not received positive confirmation of this, and that is true. We'll just have to wait and see. But one way or the other, even Ukrainian channels are now effectively admitting that the days of Vuhledar itself are numbered, and that the situation there is now critical. We have had a lot more information, important, clarifying information about the situation in Selidovo and Ukrainsk. And the first relates to Selidovo, and it's come from Regatta. Regatta has provided a very detailed account now of the fighting in Selidovo. And overall, I think I can summarize it by saying that it looks as if the Russians are indeed not only in Selidovo, but that they control significant sections of Selidovo. There is an intense encounter battle. The Ukrainian military, Syrsky presumably, seems to have made a decision to focus on Selidovo, apparently recognizing its importance. And anyway, there is a complex and difficult battle going on around Selidovo. Sometimes the Russians have the advantage, sometimes they fall back. The fight is being conducted in the northern and eastern areas of Selidovo. The Russians occupy various streets at various times, a sports arena apparently. At other times they withdraw and then they attack in another direction. The Ukrainians, for their part, seem to be making various attempts to break through to the village of Mikhailovka, to the west of Selidovo, which, however, continues to remain under Russian control. We now have apparently conclusive confirmation, that the village of Marinivka to the northeast of Selidovo is indeed under Russian control. I've never had any doubt about this. Some people did, but Russian troops have been seen well to the west of Marinivka, and it would be difficult to imagine that they are there if they were not in control of Marinivka. The fact that the Russians control Marinivka makes it more likely, though it doesn't prove conclusively, that the Russians also control the coal mine and the giant slag heap to the north of Selidovo itself. So it's a complex battle that is taking place in Selidovo. But the most important news is from Ukrainsk, and this is where we have, I think, significant confirmation of what is going on, because it seems that the Russians have advanced, presumably from Memrik, a significant distance north of Ukrainsk, and they have also, again, presumably advancing from the villages of Galitsinya and Zelanye Pershe, they have advanced significantly to the west of Ukrainsk from the south. The Russians also control the western village, the village immediately to the east of Ukrainsk. And there are reports that the Russians are strongly positioned in the south of Ukrainsk itself. And a film has appeared of Ukrainian civilians in Ukrainsk who are talking about the fact that they've seen the Russian troops essentially in the center of Ukrainsk, advancing deep into Ukrainsk from their positions on the eastern flank of this town. So the Russians are located to the north, the east and the south of Ukrainsk. They're present in Ukrainsk itself, and according to these Ukrainian civilians, whose reports, by the way, should not be taken as especially reliable, they are witnesses, but of course it may be that they're confusing their own, they may be confusing Ukrainian troops with Russian troops. There might be all sorts of misunderstandings going on here. But anyway, for what it's worth, these Ukrainian troops, these Ukrainian civilians, these civilians in Ukrainsk are saying that the Russians have reached, in effect, the center of Ukrainsk, attacking the town from the east. Now, all of this strongly suggests that Ukrainsk will soon fall, probably within 2 or 3 days. If all of this information is correct, we don't yet have much in the way of accurate film, but for the record, I think that this is probably true. Now, if Ukrainsk is captured by the Russians, then the Russians are free to advance westwards and capture the village of Tsukurinye, which Redovka says is their next objective after the capture of Ukrainsk itself. And I think this is likely true. There's also the village, the small town of Girnik, or Gornyak, as I've noticed the Russians call it, immediately to the south. The Russians do seem to have entered Girnik or Gornyak. There's fighting apparently going on there. But again, it's difficult to get a sense of exactly what this all means. Most likely, the Ukrainians in this area are under intense pressure because they're also having to deal with a Russian advance on their southern flank from the town of Krasnogorovka, which the Russians have now captured. So the Russians are pushing westwards and northwards from Krasnogorovka, and they're approaching the Russian forces that are pushing southward from Kalinovo, Memrik, Galitsinivka, Karlovka, all of these places. As I've said, these two Russian army groups are converging with each other, forming a very, very powerful force, one which I suspect the Ukrainians are going to find overwhelmingly strong. So that's my understanding of the fighting in the south. Now, further north, around Pokrovsk itself, there are reports that the Russians have now completed the clearing of Grodivka, the village, the important village that lies on the main road from the village of Progress, which the Russians captured either in early August or in July, and which leads to the eastern suburb of Pokrovsk itself, which is Mirnograd, that the Russians have now completely cleared Grodivka, and it is reasonable. It's probably, these sort of reports may suggest that at some point within the next 24 hours, or perhaps tomorrow, the Russian Defense Ministry is going to confirm the capture of Grodivka. And of course, there's also these reports that the Russians are advancing from Novogrodivka, a little to the south, that they are now in the process of capturing or of attacking all sorts of these villages of Suche Yar and other villages in this area. And I should say that just before I started making this program, I saw a report on a Russian Telegram channel, and this is only a report, there's no confirmation of this, but I saw a report that the Russians have now captured the village of Lisivka, which lies to the northeast of Novogrodivka. And if the Russians have indeed captured Suchi Yar and Lisivka, well, then the next objective will be Dachinske, village to the west of these two places, and the main highway will have been cut. It's the same highway that I've discussed many times, the one that leads from Donetsk to Pokrovsk, and which skirts around Selidovo. And I've explained many times why the Russians want to or need to control this highway in order to sort out their logistic operations prior to the major battle for Pokrovsk. Now, if we put all of this together, it's not difficult to understand what the Russians are doing. They are, as I said, gradually breaking down, fragmenting and breaking down the Ukrainian forces in southern Donbas, in Vuhledar, in Kurakhovo, which are connected to the Ukrainian troops in Vuhledar. In the area north of Krasnogorovka, in the fields, we've heard less about this famous cauldron that we've been hearing so much about. The Russians will no doubt occupy these fields very soon, and any Ukrainian troops who are still there will no doubt be either rounded up and taken prisoner, or perhaps they'll be killed in the inevitable firefights. They have no hope of resupply, and for the record, I think most of them by now have left. So these fields are now soon going to be fully occupied by the Russians. Of that I have no doubt. So the Russians want to capture all of these places. They want to capture Selidovo and Ukrainsk and Kurakhovo and Girnik or Gornyak. And they, of course, already control Novogrodivka, and they probably control Grodivka as well. And they want to control all of these other villages, Lisivka, Suchi Yar, Dachinska, Kruty Yar, Krasny Yar, Nikolaevka, which, again, I suspect that by now they already control. And then they will complete the operation to clear the villages east of Pokrovsk along the main road to Konstantinovka, villages like Vozvizhenka, Novoekonomichke, all of these places. And then the main battle for Pokrovsk itself will begin. And the Russians, meanwhile, are now bombing Pokrovsk. There is no electric power any longer, apparently, in the town. I gather that the logistics are breaking down, and this is important because the Ukrainians rely on Pokrovsk to act as a hub for logistic supplies to other Ukrainian forces further east. So if Pokrovsk itself can't be supplied with logistics, then it's difficult to see how the Ukrainian forces further east in Toretsk and other places can be supplied with logistics either, at least not to the same degree. So the Russians are already apparently sending some of their drones to interfere with Ukrainian logistic supplies along these main roads. And I gather that there's reports that Russian drones are also operating along all of the main supply roads. Now, coming back to what I was saying about the Kursk situation, as the Rasputitsa approaches, with the Ukrainians finding it increasingly difficult to use the roads in this area because of the continuous presence of the Russian drones and artillery and other things. The movement of Ukrainian troops will gradually slow to a crawl. The fields will become marshy and, or at least soft. The ground will become soft. It will become increasingly difficult to coordinate and move forces, because trying to move armed men across fields in winter or autumn with the rain is going to be extremely difficult to do. Of course, there's, as I said, a shortage of electric power now. And anyway, the whole situation is going to continue to get increasingly grim. To reiterate again, unlike the Ukrainians, the Russians can use the roads, and soon they will have access to the main supply road from Donetsk, and they are far more abundantly supplied with armored vehicles and machines. And of course, they have heavy superiority in artillery and aircraft, aviation. So with every day, with every week, as we move towards the autumn and the winter, the situation is going to start to shift steadily against the Ukrainians in this battle area. It is a misconception that the Rasputitsa slows the Russians down. There's no evidence that it has done so significantly at any point in the war, because of the particular advantages that the Russian army possesses. The fact that it can continue to use the roads, the fact that its armor is better adapted to these conditions than the Western armor that Ukraine increasingly relies on is. The Rasputitsa works in Russian interests rather than against it. Anyway, there we are. That's the situation in the Pokrovsk area. Now, there's been actually less information from Toretsk and Chasiv Yar and Seversk and other places. This doesn't mean that things aren't going on there. I believe, this is my own sense, that the Ukrainians are facing a very critical situation in Chasiv Yar, one that they're not acknowledging and one that the Russians are not discussing. This is because precisely because there's been this silence, even though we get tantalizing bits of information every so often, like the fact that the Russians have captured the village of Grigorivka to the northeast of Chasiv Yar. The pictures that show Russian troops now dead center in the central area of Chasiv Yar. The pictures that we saw a short time ago of the Ukrainian tanks facing northward in the western suburbs of Chasiv Yar. I suspect, as I said, that there is an absolutely critical situation playing out in Chasiv Yar, about which we have few details. And of course, we also have multiple reports that in the Kupiansk area, around Kupiansk, the Russians are preparing to launch some kind of offensive, possibly towards Kupiansk. We've seen there have been more pictures, more sightings of Russian soldiers on the west bank of the Zherebets River in Makeyevka. Anyway, it's all difficult to decipher, and it's always a temptation to get too deeply into the weeds to try to assess what's going on in minute detail on every part of the battlefronts. But of course, there are others who do this, and they do this very well, and I don't want to reproduce that exactly. My purpose always in giving these summaries is to give an overall sense, a feel for the state of the battle. And to go back to the point that I have been making for several weeks now, in fact, for about 2 months now, I think that Western commentators and officials have been in denial for a very long time about quite how bad the situation of the Ukrainian army has now become. We now have a cluster of articles starting to appear in the media talking about the awful situation that the Ukrainians are in, not just in any particular battle, but right across the front line. And we've had articles like this one. This is from The Economist. Hardly a magazine to take a pessimistic spin on Ukraine's prospect. Danger in Donbas as Ukraine's front line falters. Yuri, a soldier attached to the 59th Brigade based near Ukrainsk, says Ukrainian losses have been significant. A reinforcement of inexperienced infantrymen sent from Ukraine's 71st Brigade were wiped out. Over 3 days, 100 became zero. Some ran, some fell. An entire company of Ukrainian troops, in other words, within 3 days, disappeared. And that's just in one place. We're also learn about the huge Russian advantages in drones and electronic warfare, that the Russian Air Force and artillery can react almost in real time. Everything that moves and is not protected is destroyed. And we have all kinds of claims about how Ukraine's mobilization program up to now has been a failure. And a soldier from Ukraine's 79th Brigade reckons that he has already lost more soldiers in 2024 than in the previous 18 months. And anyway, we've had huge amounts of information like this. That's The Economist. There's been other similar claims from other places. Zelensky continues to chase his tail in the sense that he continues to do the same thing that he's been doing many times, launching drone attacks across Russia, increasingly ineffectively, by the way. One gets the sense that over time, the Russians have gradually perfected their defenses against drones. And, well, I'm now hearing anecdotal reports about the situation in Kiev from visitors. And I don't want to say more or too much about these, but apparently the reports all speak of a severely deteriorating situation, of collapsing morale, of an economy that has become completely dysfunctional, and where the statistics bear no relation whatever to reality, and of a political leader, Zelensky, and his immediate entourage, who many Ukrainians now consider have cut themselves off from reality and who are therefore becoming increasingly delusional. even as everything falls apart around them. Now, these last comments, as I said, are from visitors who've been to Ukraine. And again, I don't want to say too much, but we see that the Western media is also starting to see that the situation is becoming completely calamitous. So, what does the West do? Well, it seems to me that there are three separate strands of thought in the West. One can be described as just go on doing more of the same. And that seems to be what the Pentagon is up to. The Pentagon basically doesn't want further escalation. It doesn't want its precious ATACMS and JASSMs missiles used on deep strikes against Russia. It sees this as pointlessly escalating, and it recognizes that doing so is not going to achieve anything useful on the battlefront. It will antagonize the Russians, create all kinds of problems for the United States in the future as the Russians weigh up their options about how they will strike back against the Americans in their own time. And at the same time, it will not reverse the outcome of the war. And that this current of thinking exists has now been confirmed by an article in the Financial Times. Biden administration split over Ukraine's use of US weapons inside Russia. Pentagon and intelligence community caution against deployment of ATACMS missiles by Kiev. And we are told that the Pentagon and the intelligence community have cautioned against the use of long-range weapons deep inside Russia. The latter, that's the intelligence community, has assessed that 90% of Russian aircraft have been relocated to airfields at least 300 kilometers away from Ukrainian-controlled territory outside the range of ATACMS. I don't believe one specific capability will be decisive. We know that the Russians have actually moved their aircraft that are using the glide bombs beyond the range of ATACMS, US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said at a meeting of the Ukraine contact group at Ramstein Air Base in Germany. He added that Ukraine could target strategic targets inside Russia with drones and other domestically produced weapons. And the Financial Times goes on to say that US defense officials say Kiev should prioritize using Western weapons to defend eastern and northern regions of Ukraine, as well as to retain access to the Black Sea and to pressure Russian forces in Crimea. And so that's the Pentagon. They don't really want to change anything. They don't want to give Ukraine the option of conducting deep strikes inside Russia. They say this isn't going to achieve anything. It's a mistake. It's another sacrifice of a capability. It will annoy the Russians and it will achieve nothing useful. That's one view. The other view is one that is being promoted by Chancellor Scholz and Prime Minister Meloni and some people in Europe. Scholz in particular has an election coming, a parliamentary election coming in Germany next year. He is deeply unpopular. His government is falling apart all around him. The German economy is in crisis. Volkswagen is now considering closing its factories, some of its factories in Germany, which, by the way, will be a shock to the German people if it happens. It's been a taboo for German automakers to close factories in Germany itself. They can open and close factories in other countries, but for them to start doing that in Germany will come as a shock to the German understanding of the industrial strength of their own country. And on that last topic, I read an incredible plaintive article somewhere in the German media, I forget which place now, comparing the military industrial prowess of Russia with Germany, about the way in which the Russians have vastly exceeded Germany's military industrial output, that the Russians, out of their existing production, could supposedly re-equip the German Bundeswehr every 6 months, right from the bottom up, whereas at current rates of production, it will take Germany up to 2066 to replace all of the equipment that it has given to Ukraine. So Chancellor Scholz is aware of all of this. He's aware of the mood in Germany. He's been shocked, no doubt, by the election results in Thuringia and Saxony that I discussed last week. He's probably aware that even in Western Germany, the establishment parties, the SPD and the Greens, are now living on borrowed time. So finally, far too late in the day, and without much conviction, or so it seems to me, he's starting to talk about peace. He's talking about the need for negotiations. He's talking about territorial concessions to the Russians, though he's incredibly vague about what that means exactly. He seems to be talking about all of this to Zelensky, and Zelensky so far is showing no interest. But anyway, there is, or so it seems to me, finally some movement in Europe towards negotiations. And to anticipate, I suspect that Scholz has also been reaching out to the Brazilians and the Indians to try to get some kind of peace process going. I'll come to all of that later. But anyway, that's what Scholz wants to do. And he is promoting his ideas, but he comes against the roadblock which President Zelensky represents. And then there is the State Department and Tony Blinken. Now, yesterday I said that my own view, my opinion was that the British and the Ukrainians and the Americans, Blinken and Lamy, are now combining to try to get the Ukrainians to initiate negotiations, even as they're telling the Ukrainians that the Ukrainians will soon get their permission to use missiles for deep strikes into Russia. I thought about this a lot over the last 24 hours, and I've now revisited that view. And I've come to a different view, a completely different view. I think that there are some people in the United States, in the administration, perhaps Jake Sullivan, who do want some kind of negotiation process underway, who quietly share the views of people like Olaf Scholz. But I think the British and the State Department and Tony Blinken himself, and quite plausibly the President of the United States, all continue to be profoundly committed to Project Ukraine and are still intent on prolonging and escalating the war. One of them, admittedly no longer in the US government, Victoria Nuland, has now given an interview in which she's all but admitted that the United States played a central role in torpedoing the agreement that the Ukrainians and the Russians had almost agreed with each other in Istanbul in April 2022. And I was frankly stunned by how brazen she was about it. The why I should be stunned about that kind of behaviour from Victoria Nuland after all this time, I do genuinely ask myself, but never mind. Anyway, My sense is that these people have not given up on Project Ukraine. They still delude themselves or believe in some way that they can still force some kind of win, and that all that it needs is some last major act of escalation. And that escalation is going to take the form of granting Ukraine permission to conduct the deep strikes into Russia. Now, why they believe that launching deep strikes into Russia is going to make any difference to the overall military picture, I have absolutely no idea. I recall a program that I did on Daniel Davis Deep Dive, in which Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, who is, after all, a US military officer, made the point that unrestricted bombing of Germany and Japan did not prevent these two countries from continuing to wage their war against the United States. He also made the point that heavy Russian missile strikes and bombing attacks on Ukraine have also not forced the Ukrainians into submission. The United States and Ukraine and Britain do not have that capability to conduct that kind of missile offensive against the Russians. There is an article in CNN which says that Ukraine has already run through most of the ATACMS missiles that it was originally supplied, that the number of ATACMS missiles that Ukraine was provided, that it still has and which it is still able to use, is now very diminished. The United States is very unwilling to supply more, at least the Pentagon is, because they need these ATACMS missiles for their own uses in the Pacific, in the Middle East, in those sort of places. And that, by the way, will apply also to the JASSMs missiles. Neither of these missiles, neither the ATACMS nor the JASSMs, even the long-range version of the JASSMs, have anything like the range to be able to conduct a comprehensive missile offensive against Russia, by far the biggest country in the world, with industrial facilities far away in the Urals and in Siberia, well out of reach of any missiles launched from Ukraine. And of course, if ATACMS missiles are launched, are sent to conduct deep strikes into Russia with their 300 or so kilometer range, the launchers have to be brought close to the Russian border. The Russians have already been destroying launchers, HIMARS launchers, which are the same launchers as those used to launch the ATACMS. The Russians have been destroying them in the dozens over the last month or so. So the number of launchers must also now be in short supply. And if we're talking about the JASSMs, well, any aircraft that tries to launch JASSMs missiles from near the Russian border, which would again be needed to achieve any effective strikes against Russian facilities deep inside Russia. Well, any aircraft that operates close to the Russian border is also going to be at serious risk of being shot down by the Russians. So this makes absolutely no sense. But as I have discussed many times, with neocons, actual capabilities, limits on capabilities, is not something that they are ever interested in addressing. It scarcely ever forms a topic of discussion in the articles that they write. Always the assumption is that if the capability is used, it will somehow have, through some magical process, have the effect that they expect. To understand how wrong that is, look at the story of the ATACMS missiles. Compare the expectations that many had of what the ATACMS would do when the question of their supply was first floated. I remember reading all kinds of articles in the British and American media about how using the ATACMS missiles would enable the Ukrainians to isolate Crimea, to attack all of its entry points by sea and by land and by air, that Crimea would become isolated, brought under siege, and that the Russian defences in Crimea would somehow collapse. Well, we've had the better part of 10 months now of the ATACMS being used in significant numbers in Ukraine, and none of that has happened. Every so often an ATACMS missile hits a target, a ferry or a Russian boat somewhere. Sometimes they manage to get through and hit a Russian airfield or an air defense radar or something of that kind. But when one contrasts the expectations of what the ATACMS would do with what they actually have done, the contrast is stark. So far, just to say, there's been no successful ATACMS strike on the Kerch Bridge, and nor has there been a successful strike on the Kerch Bridge with Storm Shadows either. So why it's assumed that these missile strikes on Russia are going to make any difference? Really, if one is living in a factual, fact-based, objective universe, it begs the immediate question, the one very questions that the Pentagon are asking. But as I said, for the neocons who now dominate thinking in the State Department, which appears to have become their major bureaucratic fortress, it looks as if they're not interested in that kind of discussion. They continue to have the ear of the president, and they're lobbying now, and lobbying intensively to allow the missiles to be used in exactly that kind of way. Now, all of that brings us nowhere further in terms of the conflict. If the Western powers were united in supporting, in backing a peace initiative in Ukraine, well, the Brazilians and the Indians have shown that they might conceivably be swung round. One of the points I didn't make in my program yesterday, or the day before yesterday, is that the Russians, for the first time, are making public criticisms of their Indian and Brazilian friends. These criticisms were heavily veiled in the comments that President Putin himself has made, but they've been close to explicit in the comments that Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, has made, which I discussed yesterday, when he says that no peace initiative proposed by anyone has actually addressed the question of what happens to Russians in Ukraine and in Donbas. It's quite clear that he's talking about the Brazilians and the Indians. And of course, he names them. He actually specifically talks about them. And he contrasts their stance with that of the Chinese. The Russians have clearly been irritated by the stance that the Indians and the Brazilians have taken. I think myself that the relationship with India and between Prime Minister Modi and President Putin is so strong that all of this will eventually be brushed over. But I think with Brazil and with President Lula, where there have also been differences over the elections in Venezuela, I think Russian annoyance will linger, and I think that the trust that has previously existed between Putin and Lula and between Russia and Brazil has been dented. Just saying. But the fact remains, an intelligent Western diplomacy might be able to capitalize on these doubts or these positions that the Indians and the Brazilians have sought to take. But the West instead continues to be led down this blind alley, or so it seems to me, by the neocons with these new plans for deep strikes inside Russia. And I'm going to say straight away that I think I've now come round to the view that this proposal for deep strikes inside Russia, far from facilitating negotiations, as I thought might be the case in my programme yesterday, I think its purpose is to prevent negotiations altogether. Ultimately, the neocons, even if they still sometimes think that victory can be achieved, the one thing they do not want is a negotiated conclusion to this war. And they're saying to themselves, how can we prevent it? Missile strikes on Russia is the way. Well, there we are. Even as all of these diplomatic games continue, Ukraine continues to go down. I read somewhere a very sad piece about how somebody visited a cemetery in Ukraine and noticed that it had doubled its size over the course of the last year. It looks as if nothing can help Ukraine escape its agony. Well, there we are. That's the end of my programme today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programmes on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. Don't forget also to support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and also to check out our shop. And last but not least, if you like this programme, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me from today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.